Let's understand the world a little better. I'm your host, Timon Wunderlich, and with me is Don J. Wyatt. He's a history and philosophy professor at Middlebury College. He has a Ph.D. from Harvard, and his most recent book is Slavery in East Asia. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today, slavery in East Asia, which I would say is an often overlooked topic, especially in the Western world. Would you agree with that?
I would, and largely unknown, Timon. But it also is a subject that is very much off the grid among East Asians themselves, largely because there's a tendency in East Asia to emphasize a kind of grand narrative of history, one that underscores accomplishments.
Interesting. So, would you say the civilization, the population in East Asia, does even know about its history in that terms?
I think it's somewhat subliminally known, but it is viewed as a history that is back there. Then was then, and now is now. And it's viewed as uh, a circumstance that has no direct bearing on present day realities.
I would later go into talking about the reappraisal, the historic, in Asia, but also in the Western world. I'm interested in why that happened so late. Um, but first, let me ask you. This might be a dumb question, but what would you say is the definition of slavery?
Slavery, by definition, has been a controversial topic, but I think we can um, basically understand slavery as defined by a couple of sets of characteristics. The first one I would emphasize is that it is a condition of involuntary servitude, uh, which results in certain uh, restrictions on the person's freedoms, their degree of mobility, and also perhaps in that person being regarded as property. And I think the other thing that I would emphasize is a kind of commodification. In other words, slaves have historically been thought of as people who can be bought or sold.
Let me ask you there. That is not are each of these points a necessity? Because I actually did some or a little bit of research, obviously, for this podcast, and I looked up the definition of slavery because I was interested in the. There was an older definition which stated that. The ownership of another person, that is slavery, and now there's a newer, there was a modern definition of slavery which included uh, forced labor, for example, through
Mhm.
fraud, through other
Mhm.
activities which not necessarily include ownership.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that ownership is no longer a necessity, at least not in modern times. But this brings me back to the first set of characteristics that I tried to emphasize, this condition of involuntary servitude. A slave is a person who um, is subjected to this condition, but also very much defined by this condition. In other words, their raison d'etre really is what they do, the servitude that they provide for um, the individual who controls them. And this can take various forms. There's, of course, um, labor service, and of course, we're very aware of sexual servitude. So it can take many forms, but the person is defined by this servitude that they provide, and it's in that sense um, it's it's dehumanizing, just as being a robot is to be dehumanized.
In Europe, at least, I think with in the Middle Ages, slavery started or became at least bigger through wars where opponents were captured afterwards. Is that the same thing that happened in Asia? Is that how it, in a way, began to form?
The origin of slavery in East Asia, using China as the principal example, where culture first developed uh, in that context, is one in which we know that the earliest dynasty about which we know much about, the Shang dynasty, established about 1650 BCE, um, was one in which one of the pastimes of the aristocracy, the nobility of that particular dynasty, was foraging expeditions to take non Shang captives. These people were thought to be brought back for labor services, principally for the task of uh, building royal tombs. But we also know that the Shang practice human sacrifice. And though we don't know a great deal of detail about the practice, it's reasonable to think that these individuals often fell victim to that convention on the part of the Shang nobility.
And did they have a common origin? Where were they from?
They were various peoples who were not part of the orbit of Shang culture. And it's important to remember that geographically, at that time, China was a much smaller entity than it is now in terms of being thought of as China, in other words, the populations. But these peoples were various Aboriginal peoples who were culturally distinct from the Shang.
But came from within the same region geographically.
Yeah, more or less the same region, largely further to the west, further to the south, but not part of that particular population.
And in other Asian countries and in other in later dynasties, how did that evolve? How was it different to that Shang dynasty slavery?
This practice of rounding up people for tomb building and for sacrifice uh, basically terminated. It ceased to be part of Chinese civilization as we think of it. But enslavement continued, particularly under the Zhou dynasty, the succeeding dynasty, which was established in about 1046, 45 BCE. Slavery during that time was largely domestic slavery, household slavery, uh, and it was basically complemented by an institution of serfdom, which was not slavery per se, but individuals who were responsible for um, farming practices and were very much attached to um, their overlords, if not the states on which if not the property, the estates on which they labored. And slavery continued um, throughout the process of the procession of history. And largely was driven by war, largely because uh, China, despite the dynastic tradition, was basically a country in disunity up until the end of the 3rd century BCE, when the Qin dynasty unified China.
And was I able to see a development or an increase in slaves throughout the dynasties?
It's fair to say that slavery increased as population increased. And despite the war and turmoil, it's thought that the Chinese population did tend to increase overall. And by the time of the unification, the tradition, the convention of enslavement was entrenched. And I guess the other important factor, one that we haven't touched upon yet, is that um, China and East Asia generally is a region in which uh, not only exogenous slavery, that is, the slavery of outsiders, was practiced, but endogenous slavery has always been practiced as well. The enslavement of um, fellow Chinese, fellow Koreans, fellow Japanese, uh, Vietnamese.
And which ideas were other Chinese within China enslaved?
Could you repeat the question?
And under what circumstances or why were Chinese people within China
Oh,
enslaved?
thank you. Um, China has practiced uh, two forms of slavery over time. There's been official slavery and private slavery. Um, and official slavery has largely been the product of, again, warfare, but usually in the form of internal rebellion or someone who has offended higher authority. This person, um, typically, the transgressor was executed, but the transgressor's survivors were enslaved. And this was the root of official slavery as we have come to know it.
I'm wondering, was there ever a time where people from further away were enslaved? Because there was, for example, as with Europe and Africa, where
Hmm.
um, people were taken from there because there were more people in a way who we were easier to be enslaved or so. I don't really know the circumstances. This
Yeah.
isn't supposed to sound wrong. Was there something like that in Asia as well?
In East Asia, there was an attempt, there was a practice of starting near at hand, and consequently, various non Sinic, non Chinese peoples were enslaved, particularly Malay peoples who were nearby. But the practice of traveling great distances in order to take captives uh, and bring them back in enslavement is not a real East Asian convention, as of course it was a Western or became a Western convention. Outsiders did become enslaved in China, but they were largely brought there by other outsiders. And for instance, the Persians and Subsequently, the Arabs, in their trade with China, often brought slaves. And many of these slaves oftentimes ended up in China, either under their original masters or under Chinese masters. And this is a practice that does not begin until really what we would consider medieval times. So, particularly the Arab slave trade, we're really talking at best the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries of the Common Era.
So Arabs were trading slaves with Chinese,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
where and the slaves themselves, where did they come from?
These slaves being basically transported by the Arabs largely hailed from East Africa, the East African coastline.
Uh, at the peak of or let me first ask, when was the down turn of slavery, or when did it get more and more illegal? I would assume it is. I think in most of Asia it is now illegal. When did that
Yes.
start?
Well, you have to take it country by country, largely because uh, this making slavery illegal happened in different ways and different fashions in different areas. And this is a subject on which I am pursuing some research. Um, we can find the earliest objections to slavery in China proper, uh, beginning at what is comparable to what we think of as the beginning of the Christian era. So even slightly before. So in the 2nd century BCE, there are some who speak against it. This continues, and it's largely the contrast is this movement toward some sort of abolition is driven by economic factors. The fact that these individuals were not part of the tax rolls uh, in in China in particular, but um, eventually this continues to be a factor in subsequent ages. But the truth of the matter is that slavery itself was not outlawed in China until the beginning of the 20th century, 1910 or so. And even then, it wasn't a general emancipation. It was simply that existing slaves could no longer be bought or sold.
Hmm. And how did that come about? Where was the tipping point?
Mm,
Um,
there were many factors involved, but a lot of it was largely economic. And I think it's fair to say that there was some influence of uh, Western contact, Western constitutionalism, and ideas of uh, freedom and liberation were beginning to be entertained in the East Asian context, particularly the Chinese context. Long before that development, though, slavery was outlawed in for a certain sector of the Chinese population, that being uh, most commoners or all commoners, really. This was during the Tang Dynasty. with the Tang Code, a set of laws which made it illegal to um, enslave someone who was not already enslaved.
And Tang Dynasty, at what point of time was that approximately?
This period would be the 7th through the 10th centuries of the Common Era. And after that, commoners could not be enslaved. There had already been established by this time, though, a subset of society, a kind of underclass of individuals called Jian peoples, people who were uh, basically a subgroup and thought to be base, as the term translates. This base part of the population is thought to have averaged about 5% of the Chinese population. And all slaves, all endogenous, that is, Chinese slaves, were from this sector.
Hmm. Were they a part of the group that can be called commoners, or were they in a way?
They were not called commoners. Yeah,
Oh,
they were distinguished from the common people. And their situation was one in which enslavement was hereditary. So it continued in this way.
and also slavery from outside of China was also.
And also, slavery from outside China was practiced. And in fact, got a huge infusion from the fact that uh, Chinese commoners could no longer be enslaved. So outsiders became naturally targets of slavery.
I can imagine that. How did the were there then started more wars because of that, or how uh did the Chinese then get their slaves when it wasn't possible, like they in the way they did that before?
This was really the arena of private slavery, the companion form of slavery to official slavery. And we have basically individuals who go out seeking slaves. And the peoples that they tended to be most predatory toward were people of the southern regions who were not, again, considered necessarily ethnically Han Chinese, the dominant ethnic group of China. Uh, People of the Indonesian peninsula, peoples in the southern regions, the southern tier of the empire.
At its peak, how many slaves were there in China, and how and as a percentage as well? Is that known?
The general thinking is that the the largest percentage that we can think of is probably only about 2% of the population at any given time. And for a dynasty like the Sung dynasty, the period from the 10th century to the 13th centuries of the Common Era, the population at that time, by about the mid 12th century, about 1150, probably was about 120 million people. So consequently, 2%, we're talking um, somewhere in the neighborhood of um, 200 to 2 million to 3 million slaves as part of the population. And then you have all sorts of variation. For instance, in Korea, we at the basically by about the 17th century, uh, slaves, and these are all endogenous slaves, by the way, constituted somewhere between 30 and 35% of the population. So Korea was a slave society, quote, slave society, in a way that China never was.
Um, and within, for example, Korea and China, but also the US, how different was maybe the view on a slave, or uh, the uh, the the life of a slave also? So I would assume in some countries it was harsher than in others.
Yeah, that would seem to be true. And it probably varied a great deal. Um, given, and speaking about the East Asian context, given that the life of commoners could be quite brutal, uh, I would envision that the lives of slaves was uh, quite arduous, quite quite arduous. There were some exceptions, particularly in the arena of official slavery. Um, China, Korea, and even Vietnam had the practice of eunuchs who were in fact slaves. Uh, and these individuals, because of their proximity to the emperor and their lives at the court, uh, probably had a much better, a much less arduous existence. You know. But of course, um, there were many sacrifices that were made for that, and of course, eunuchism being the most prominent of them.
And again, trying to put it into contrast, slavery in the Western world and in Asia, how different was it?
I think it's different largely based on the fact that in the West, eventually slavery became race based.
That wasn't the case in Asia.
And that was not the case, uh, not in East Asia. And consequently, Western slavery has a kind of conspicuousness that East Asian slavery never really had. I've spoken in the past about the relative invisibility of slavery in East Asia, largely because it was not race based. Whereas in the West, um, it was overt, it was obvious.
So why do you think it never came to that place? Because if at some point less and less Chinese people were enslaved within China, and foreigners or foreign slaves were traded to China, I would have assumed that it would in a way also become race based.
Yeah, I don't know if there were any fewer slaves. In fact, arguably there could be more, at least in terms of numbers. Uh, by later times, later imperial times. And again, the slaves who came into China were largely brought by others. And these individuals um, um, tended to remain the masters of their slaves. I guess the most notorious group, about which I write about in the book, are the Portuguese, who were the first to arrive with large numbers of African slaves, but and established themselves at the port of Macau, which became a Portuguese settlement. And their slaves there actually outnumbered the Portuguese themselves. But uh, fair to say, I think East Asia never adopted race-based slavery because it had no real need to. In other words, slaves were never the primary driver of economic production.
Interesting. Whereas in the US, it was a totally different
It
case.
was totally different. And I guess the one exceptional circumstance in East Asia is, of course, the Korean example. And as I've already mentioned to you, that's where um, the percentage number of slaves, this 30 to 35% figure, really mushroomed. And the overall population at that time was probably a bit in excess of 10 million people. So you're really talking about a lot of slaves there.
So there was more of a racially or racism in that way.
These slaves were indigenous. They were fellow Koreans.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. So, but what you mentioned is that at some point Portuguese people were bringing African slaves to China,
Yes,
to Macau,
yes, yeah. I write about this in the book. This episode, they were the first group to bring them,
and then other
and
Europeans brought them as well.
other Europeans brought them as well. But eventually, the convention begins to subside. And I think a lot of that is about slavery, the sort of Western apparatus of slavery not being able to entrench itself in East Asia very effectively.
Why is
A
that?
lot of this is political, particularly by the period of the Ming Dynasty, the 14th through the 17th, mid 17th century. Um, the country was controlling those individuals who came and was able to manage foreigners and their presence to a considerable degree.
Um, at what point did the Portuguese and other Europeans come to China then?
This was the beginning of the 16th century.
16th century,
Yeah,
and
the 15, early 1500s.
and how many Africans were brought there? What terms of scale are we talking about?
It's really hard to know, but the Portuguese brought slaves with them every place they went. And these numbers were really relatively large, I guess, in terms of the number of, when judged against the number of Portuguese uh, who came themselves.
So,
But it's really hard to know those numbers.
so the slaves that were brought were not brought for trade, but for the Portuguese themselves.
Often for themselves, for agricultural purposes, interestingly, for protective purposes. Um, um, the slaves were armed often and provided protection for their masters. Um, they performed other functions related to labor, performing as stevedores at docks and so forth.
Uh, Now, before coming to the current state and questions according to that regarding that, I was wondering, how does one, or how do you know about these things? How is research being done? How do we actually know about certain numbers of like how many slaves, for example, there were in each part of time?
Um, Percentages like that are largely guesstimates based on the research of scholars. Uh, but um, the other thing that I rely on, I guess, of course, and all uh, uh, good historians rely on, are sources. So written texts, uh, in my case, texts from the Chinese, of the period. So primary source materials, um, some writing in Japan, um, um, but mainly the Chinese source materials.
Which are public?
Yeah, these materials are available.
Because that's kind of a nice segue to the reappraisal we talked in the beginning about, and there not being really being an a reworking of that of slavery in Asia, within Asia, and but it is not the case that this knowledge, these texts from that time where about that is written, are not public for the are not made public. They are public, but they're not
Yeah,
talked about. Okay.
yeah, they're sources from the time, and yeah, they're publicly available. Uh, yeah, yeah.
So to touch upon that point again, were there countries that within Asia that already have that have already excused themselves for these things?
Oh, making some sort of apology
Exactly. Yes.
for hmm,
Did China do that?
China. It hasn't happened. There, I guess, when was it? I believe in 2017 or so. Um, the Japanese government issued a statement of apologies for the predations against the indigenous Ainu people,
Hmm.
um, who were subjected to enslavement, but mainly they were sort of victimized in the same way the American Indians, for instance, were in the United States. Uh, but there was a statement of regret, apology uh, made on the part of the government. I'm trying to think. That's the only instance I can think of. And a lot of it is, of course, again, the endogenous character of East Asian slavery. Who do you apologize to? There's no particular other group that you have offended, especially when you've been enslaving your own people.
I guess that is right. So that you would see as the main reason as to why there also might not be um, as much knowledge about the topic.
I think so. It's a sort of embedded, invisible institution that was perpetuated for centuries, and I've only been able to touch on so many aspects of it. The whole convention of concubinage, which we haven't even really touched upon. Um, uh, Concubines can be thought of as de facto slaves as well. So,
Actually, I have to be honest. I don't know that word, concubines. What does it mean?
it is a concubine is a woman who is brought into your house who is not your wife, and yet she's available to you sexually
Mm.
for the purpose of producing offspring.
For the purpose of producing offspring.
Hmm.
Okay, and that was a major part of Asian slavery as
Hmm.
well.
Yes, and this has to do, particularly in China, with the convention that the patrilineal line, the sacrificial rites to the patrilineal line, had to be performed by males. Consequently, the premium on having male children. So, for instance, if although you can only have one official wife in China, conventionally, if that wife was either barren or failed to produce a male, uh, someone who could afford it might bring another woman into the household
Interesting. So,
expressly for that purpose.
but these slave or not slave. What was the name again?
Concubines, yeah.
Concubines. They were
But
not seen as
these
less than, or were they as
they
slaves?
were they were uh, more elevated than normal slaves.
Because I would have assumed with the that it's not regarded as something well seen, having children with a slave, or
That's right. But this person basically had effectively slave status, largely because this gets back to commodification again. She was purchased.
mm,
Her natal family, they sold her to this person,
for that
this
purpose.
man who basically brought her into his home.
Wow. Um, is is there anything else you want to add, and or anything that I should have asked you that I didn't?
Wow. Um,
Just because we're coming to the end of the interview, I want to ask
yeah,
you: is
we
there?
are coming to the end, I assume. Boy, what should you have asked me that? Hmm. How about what is the relevance of all this to our current situation? Why study slavery of medieval East Asia? What does it tell us about current times?
Well, why study slavery of East Asia?
Largely because I think we like to coddle ourselves and say to ourselves that we have the implicit belief that um, ours is a story of human progress and that we are moving forward in time and that slavery and the sort of unfreedoms associated with that practice are um, primitive and practices that um, we're moving away from, that we're leaving behind. And I think the important message is that we can never really fully escape the baggage of the past, and that slavery is still with us. And not likely to be eradicated anytime soon. Consequently, I think studying slavery in East Asia is cautionary because it informs us that we're not the creatures of progress that we sometimes like to think we are.
Uh, in studying slavery in East Asia, do you have found any ways to fight it, not just in Asia but in the whole world, or hurdles against it in a way, something that can be applied today?
The best way to combat it is to be mindful of its history. And I think what I've tried to do is kind of give a voice to the voiceless in this regard, and to let at least some people know that this was an atrocity that occurred over a long period of time, and that if we're aware of it, then we can be mindful of trying to take steps to not perpetuate it.
Um, Thank you very much. I want to go over to the unless you have anything else to add. I want to go over to the rapid fire questions. So some um, questions which I would be pleased if you could answer them within 2 or 3 sentences.
I'm at your disposal,
So
Tiemann.
you're all ready then?
I'm ready.
Then let's begin. If you had a big poster, let's say on Times Square, everybody would see it. What would you put on it?
Be kind to one another.
Do you have a favorite quote?
I have a favorite quote almost every day. It changes daily, but one that I like today is we are not makers of history, we are made by history. Martin Luther King Jr.
That is good. I like that too. Do you have a controversial opinion? I believe what almost nobody else does.
I don't even really think that's really possible to have. We're all we're all social animals, and I kind of believe that whatever idea you have, no matter how preposterous it is, there's probably someone else on the planet who also has it. So I think I'll take a pass on that one.
That's still a good answer. That's still good. What would you have liked to known earlier when you started with 20, let's say?
Wow, that's a tough one, but maybe how little time there would be in the future.
What's your newest biggest insight?
Newest biggest insight. Hmm. I think maybe I've sort of referred to it already. Largely that we can never really escape our most primitive and predatory impulses.
What do you see as the current biggest problem in regards to fighting slavery in the world?
Hmm. A lack of information.
How would you spend?
Uh,
Oh, sorry.
a lack of information about how prevalent and um, difficult to stamp out it is.
How would you spend $1 billion to try to solve that problem?
Hmm. Maybe it's the Confucianist in me, but the answer is usually to be found in education.
So more spending towards education. Um,
Yeah.
and how would you, in general, not necessarily in regards to slavery, how would you spend $10 billion to make the world a better place?
Hmm. I think I would subdivide the money into three parts, three portions, and I think combating climate change, providing famine relief, and combating human trafficking.
With that, I want to thank you very much, Don, for taking the time. If you want to know more about Don and his insights and knowledge, check out his book, Slavery in East Asia. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Timon, for having me. It's been a very pleasurable experience, and thank you for your questions. And I hope I've offered something edifying to your audience.
Definitely have.